Bristol, Tennessee is the kind of place where the days sound familiar. A mower somewhere in the afternoon, a dog that barks at the same cars, kids' voices folding into the cicadas at dusk. On Henson Road, a double-wide sat back from the gravel, a home that held 3 generations, and the sort of routines that make a life feel steady even when money is tight and schedules don't line up. Lena Marie Rose, 57, was the grandmother, the anchor. Her daughter Tasha Michelle Rose Milhorn, 39, moved through rooms with the speed of a mother who has too much to do and not enough time to do it. James Jamie Milhorn, 36, was the stepdad, steady, practical, the sort who checked doors twice and made sure tires were good enough for Monday morning. There were children in the house, several of them, small and loud, in the way small people are. It was a crowded kind of ordinary, and it worked. On the edge of that family, Robert Seth Denton had been a presence you felt before you saw. 19 years old, tall, often in camouflage, a young man whose intensity worried people who loved him and irritated people who didn't know what to do with it. He had grown up in and around that house and then moved out. He'd lived nearby and bounced between couches and small apartments. He'd gone into the military and come back out. The lines between his life and his family's had frayed. Some had snapped. What everyone agrees on is the feeling. A long, simmering anger about his mother. A list of complaints that didn't shrink but grew. A sense that every conversation could turn into an argument without warning. The cards on the fridge were ordinary. School flyers, a church notice, a reminder about an appointment. The calendar on the wall had August 2015 crowded with notes. Saturday the 29th should have been like the others. Errands, late lunch, the kind of evening where television fills the room and kids ask for snacks they've already had. The younger children orbited the living room and kitchen. Jamie kept half an eye on the door, as he always did. Tasha moved between tasks, answering to her name every 30 seconds because mothers always do. Lena's presence had its own gravity. She knew where everything was and how to make the day go the way it needed to go. They knew Seth might come by. Family ties in small towns don't sever cleanly. Even when there have been arguments, even when there are don't-come-around rules, people still drift toward each other because blood and habit pull harder than pride. There had been words between him and his mother before, sharp, repeating ones. There had been warnings. There were stories, too, about the way he talked when he was angry, about threats said like jokes, and not jokes said like threats. If you asked the sheriff later, he would talk about a long-standing hatred he believed the son carried for the mother. Inside the house, they were trying to have a Saturday, late afternoon, bent toward evening, and the big truth about small houses came back. There aren't many ways to keep a surprise out. The door opened, and Seth was suddenly not a possibility, but a person standing in the entry with a rifle in his hands. Not a .22 for plinking cans, not a piece of junk. A semi-automatic that carries distance in the barrel and speed in the magazine. He wore camouflage like a uniform he'd made for himself. Witnesses would later count a lot of ammunition, a number of rounds that told you the plan had been in his head long before his boots hit the steps. What followed is the sequence professionals learned to read afterward. The distance of the first shot, the angle of the second. The way a body falls tells the path of the person holding the weapon. But you don't need the later diagrams to understand what happened in the moment. Gunfire in a house is a kind of thunder that doesn't leave room for thought. People moved the way people do, when every nerve remembers what running is for. Children tried to make themselves small. A grandmother stepped into a space that wasn't built to hold heroism and tried anyway. A mother who had already done more hard days than anyone knew reached for the closest life and tried to cover it with her own. The clock doesn't slow down in real time. It speeds up. In a handful of seconds that stretch forever when you replay them, Seth fired again and again. Tosha went down in the main room, a few feet from where she had been doing the day's ordinary business. Jamie tried to move toward the threat and didn't make it. Lena met violence in her own home, on her own day, and the sound folded the evening into something it was never meant to hold. Shot after shot, delivered at close range, built a story of control, not frenzy. Rooms cleared like items on a list. That distinction would matter later in court. In the house, it simply meant there was no time to talk anyone out of anything. All through it, children watched. 6 of them, investigators would say later. Some of them under 10. That fact is one of the anchors in this story. It's also one of the reasons to tell it carefully. They heard the arguments before the noise. They saw the man with the rifle. They saw what happened to the people who kept them safe on ordinary Saturdays. And they will carry that seeing for the rest of their lives. After, they did what children do, even when fear is eating the edges of their vision. They ran where the adults told them to run. They hid where the adults told them to hide. They left the house when they could. They asked for help in voices that didn't crack because they couldn't afford to crack yet. Chaos invites answers from the nearest hands. In this house, that meant one more person stepped in. A grandfather on the edge of the property who heard what no one should hear and did what he could do. He fired a shot as the gunman moved to leave, and the bullet found its mark, a wound that would show up later. On the suspect's body and in the sheriff's briefings, it did not stop what had already been done. It did complicate the narrative and fed a defense story that would later try to make someone else the shooter. That night, it did one unarguable thing. It reminded the gunman that even within a family already ripped open, there was still resistance. Then came the part of every case that belongs to procedure. A neighbor made the 911 call. Sirens grew from somewhere too far away to somewhere too close. The road filled with blue and red. Deputies crossed the threshold with weapons high and voices low, clearing rooms, finding people, calling out what they saw into radios that turned grief into brief. A living room became crime scene tape and photo markers. A hallway became a diagram. The hum of a window unit and the beeping of a microwave clock kept their small, stupid insistence that time and temperature mattered. Paramedics moved among the fallen with the impossible triage of people whose job is to say who can be brought back and who cannot. Within the hour, the home on Henson Road was 2 things at once. A place where 3 people were dead, Toshia, Jamie, Lena, and the starting line for a manhunt. The suspect's name went out, along with the description, along with the knowledge that he had left the scene moving, possibly wounded, certainly armed at some point, identity known, history already being pulled up on screens by investigators who were still wiping their hands on boot cuffs to get drywall dust and blood off their fingers. Deputies and troopers widened circles on the map, up toward the state line, down toward county roads that funnel into the next county, toward fields and ditches where a man might dump a rifle if he planned ahead or panic. People in Bristol did what people do. They turned on porch lights. They called children inside. They stood at windows and recognized that the line between their business and my life had vanished. In kitchens, phones hummed with texts and calls. Are you okay? What happened? Do you know who? The name traveled faster than the official confirmation because names always do in small towns. By the time the sheriff stood under the mast of microphones and said what he could say, 3 dead, suspect identified, investigation ongoing, 6 children witnessed, the community's heart already knew the shape of the loss and the shape of the danger. By the next day, the search caught up to the story. Robert Seth Denton was found alive, not far from the places patrol cars had been told to watch, and taken into custody without shots fired. He carried the wound the grandfather's bullet had given him, and the silence that men choose when they believe their story will go better if they don't speak first. The rifle he'd carried in the house was gone. Whether he had stashed it well or tossed it where chance would hide it, investigators could not say yet. But even absence has weight. A missing weapon speaks of intent in a way juries recognize later, when the lab reports are neat and the photographs are in order. That is how this story opens. A family house, a Saturday evening, a young man who arrived with a rifle and a grievance he had been feeding for years. 3 people killed, children forced to watch, a grandfather shot that hit but could not heal, sirens, tape, the slow paperwork of a county learning how to breathe again. The legal language would come later: first-degree murder, aggravated counts, life without parole. For now, hold the names and the order they deserve. Lena the anchor, Toshia the mother, Jamie the stepdad who tried to stand between danger and the people he loved. And remember the children, not as witnesses or facts, but as people who did what grown-ups tell us to do in the worst moment: run, call, live. In the next part, we'll walk the night into the morning, the rapid investigation, the first interviews, the stories that tried to grow in the gap where the rifle should have been, and how a small county gathered evidence with enough care to carry a courtroom years later. But before any of that, let the opening sit in your chest the way it sits in the towns. A house on Henson Road, an ordinary day forced to carry what it should never have had to carry. When the sirens faded to a working hum and the tape went up around the house on Henson Road, the rhythm changed from emergency to evidence. Deputies spoke in short sentences, the way professionals do when the point is not to feel, but to fix facts in place. Paramedics handed the scene to investigators. The living room, so recently a normal Saturday, became a diagram. Yellow markers by .30 caliber casings, strings run to show bullet paths, measurements taken from door frames to impact points. The clock on the microwave still blinked uselessly. Outside, the gravel drive was blotted with boot prints that would be photographed and lifted, because even the bottoms of shoes tell stories. The first task was triage for the truth. Witness children, 6 of them, 5 reportedly under 10, were moved into quiet rooms at a neighbor's, then to a place where trained interviewers could ask questions once, gently, on camera. Their words were not going to carry the whole case. No decent prosecutor asks kids to do that. But they would settle the order of the night: who came in, what he carried, where he stood, who fell first, how fast it happened, which way he left. A deputy stayed with them, answering the questions children ask when the world stops making sense. Where is my mom? Am I safe? Can I call Grandma? The answers were careful, human. While that was happening, the manhunt spooled outward. The suspect was Robert Seth Denton, 19, known to live and drift close by, known to wear camouflage, known to show up angry. Patrol cars edged down the lanes that feed into Henson Road. Others covered the nearby arteries toward the state line. A bolo went out with a description, likely armed, possibly wounded, because a grandfather on the property had fired a shot as the gunman left, and the sheriff already knew that detail would matter. Ditches, hedgerows, and culverts were checked, not just for a person, but for a rifle a person might have tossed in a hurry. Nothing obvious turned up, which told its own story. Someone had either kept hold of the weapon or stashed it with intent. Inside the house, the scene spoke with the blunt grammar of close-range gunfire. Toshia lay near the center of the home she had animated all day. Jamie, who had moved toward danger, was down where a man falls when he tries to get between a weapon and the people he loves. Lena had met violence in the same rooms where she'd poured coffee and found lost shoes for years. Shots clustered, not scattered. The kind of grouping that reads as control, not panic. Investigators documented stipple, trajectory, and angle. They collected projectiles for later comparison to whatever firearm the case would eventually anchor to the shooter. A clock in the log fixed tentative time of offense in the late afternoon around 5:45 p.m., consistent with neighbors' recollections and emergency call stamps. By morning, the search lines converged. Denton was found alive, reportedly carrying the wound that the grandfather's round had given him. He did not resist. He did not explain. He went to a hospital under guard and then to the Sullivan County Jail. The arrest reset the investigation. Now there was a body to swab for gunshot residue, clothes to seize for blood transfer and fibers, a phone to image for location pings and messages, a truck to search for spent cases, magazines, and the small giveaways killers rarely remember to sanitize. Search warrants stacked on a supervisor's desk like a short book. Judges signed. Teams rolled. Interview rooms are built to look boring, so the words have nowhere to hide. When it was Denton's turn, he gave a version of events that denied responsibility. He talked about guns he liked, where he'd been going, who he'd hoped to see. In court, months later, his defense would become bolder. He wasn't the shooter at all, they'd say. They would float a story that pointed the finger at the grandfather, Curtis Rose, and a military-style M1 Garand, trying to make the single defensive shot at a fleeing suspect the centerpiece of a blame shift. Investigators had already rubbed that tail between finger and thumb and found it thin. The path of bullets inside the home did not match a third party firing from outside. The children's placement and sight lines did not match an outside shooter. The sequence read like a man moving room to room inside the house. Crime scene technicians and the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation pulled the physical case together piece by piece. Tool marks on retrieved bullets gave a caliber class consistent with .30 caliber military-style ammunition, and casing characteristics matched what you'd expect from a semi-automatic platform. Even without the murder weapon in hand, because it wasn't recovered that night or in the days after, labs can do mathematics. Class evidence plus scene geometry plus witness placement can be enough to hang charges on intent and identity. Meanwhile, GSR swabs from Denton's hands and clothing, if positive, would speak to recent firing. Blood patterns on garments would anchor him to proximity. Mobile phone data would map his approaches and exits, and search history workups could surface an appetite for the kind of violence that had just been visited on a family. As facts hardened, so did the filings. The district attorney announced 3 counts of first-degree murder layered with aggravated assault for the shot that terrorized a child, reckless aggravated assault, and felony reckless endangerment, charges that reflect not only the dead but the living who were put in mortal fear. A judge set bond so high it functioned as no bond at all. Hearings were scheduled and rescheduled. Defense motions sketched their themes early, challenge scene integrity, point at alleged contamination, insist the grandfather fired more than once, or the law enforcement misread what the house was saying. Prosecutors answered with photographs, measurements, and that one line from the sheriff that never left the file. This was the culmination of a long-standing hatred a son held for his mother. Other voices began to fill the spaces between the official statements. A roommate would later testify that Denton had talked about wanting to go on a rampage. Friends spoke about camo clothes and lots of ammunition, about a young man who had started treating the idea of violence like a hobby. Family members described years of rancor that had curdled into something darker. None of that, by itself, convicts a person. Together, it maps risk onto opportunity in a language juries understand. Meanwhile, the children's accounts, recorded properly, outside the rush of the first night, gave the timeline shape without making them shoulder more than the law will ever ask of a child. They said who came in. They said what he wore. They said what was in his hands. They drew with small fingers on room outlines and showed where people fell. Those drawings do not go on the evening news. They go in the file and then into the memory of detectives who will never forget them. There was also the medical path that every homicide needs: autopsies, fixed cause and manner of death, gunshot wounds, homicide, range of fire, close, trajectory, forward, downward, consistent with a shooter advancing through domestic space. Toxicology on victims did not matter. Their deaths were not about what they had taken, but about what had been done to them. The grandfather's medical note confirmed a single defensive shot delivered after the murders, not during them. By the time the first status conference rolled around, the case had the beginnings of a spine: eyewitness children, trajectory math, class-consistent ballistics, GSR and transfer possibilities, cell site mapping, motive evidence that tracked the long slope from grievance to gunfire, and a missing rifle that read like consciousness of guilt. Defense counsel asked for more time, as defense counsel should in a case this heavy. The judge set a trial term that would eventually slide into 2019 after fits and starts, continuances, and a seated jury willing to hear the worst kind of Saturday told with patience. In the months in between, Bristol did what towns do to keep living. Schools made space for kids whose weekends had been rewritten by violence. Churches set aside rows and let silence be part of the service. The sheriff's office avoided microphones except when they were necessary. No theatrics, no adjectives, just the asks and the facts. And the house on Henson Road settled into the new, terrible dignity of being a place of record. Mowed, tidied, quiet. The kind of quiet that keeps the names intact. The legal words would come later: conviction, life without parole, plus years for the living he endangered. And we'll get there. Part 3 goes inside the courtroom. The children's testimony handled with care. The defense's attempt to cast the grandfather as the shooter. The state's slow, relentless walk through fibers, blood, bullets, and phones. And the way a jury read control where the defense said chaos. For now, hold the shape of the night as it turned into a case, a family's loss, measured in millimeters and minutes, so that the truth could be carried without breaking. Trials don't heal anything. At their best, they put a public frame around a private rupture and ask 12 strangers to hold it steady. When Robert Seth Denton's case was finally called, years after the shots on Henson Road, the courtroom in Sullivan County filled with the kind of quiet that has its own weight. Families lined the benches shoulder to shoulder. Deputies stood along the walls. A juror's oath turned a room into a promise. The opening statements drew 2 maps. The state's map was simple and terrible. A young man walked into his family's home with a semi-automatic rifle on an August evening, moved room to room with control, and left 3 people dead while 6 children watched and survived. The defense's map asked the jury to squint until the picture blurred. Chaos, confusion, a grandfather with a military rifle, a possibility that what everyone thought they knew had the wrong center. Both sides told the jurors how to travel the evidence. Only one route would still make sense at the end. The state began with the voices that found the night and refused to let it disappear. A neighbor described the doorbell, the porch light, the 10 seconds that turned an ordinary Saturday into an ambulance address. A deputy took the stand and spoke the clipped language of first-in responders. Entry cleared, bodies located, children gathered, perimeter set. He did not use adjectives. He did not need them. Photographs did the rest: angles, markers, the geometry of domestic spaces interrupted by close-range gunfire. The jury did what juries do when the images are heavy. They looked, then they looked at their notepads, then they looked back. Then came the part everyone in the room had braced for. The children who had seen and lived were not marched into the courtroom to be tested by spectacle. Their testimony arrived the right way, recorded in a child advocacy setting. Questions asked once by trained interviewers, played for the jury with the volume of the room turned all the way down. Small voices described a big man in camouflage carrying a long gun. Small hands drew the rooms and where people fell. They did not supply drama, they supplied direction. Where he stood, where he moved, how fast it happened, that he was inside the house, not outside firing blindly from the dark. The pathologist followed, clinical and steady. Gunshot wounds delivered at close range to Toshia, Jamie, and Lena. Trajectories consistent with a shooter advancing through the rooms of a home. Not a distant exchange across thresholds or windows. No defensive wounds that read like prolonged struggle. The story written on the bodies matched the story told by the walls. This was control, not panic. Sequence, not storm. Forensics stitched the narrative tighter. Casing characteristics matched a semi-automatic platform that feeds quickly and leaves its brass behind. Stipple patterns on skin and fabric confirmed proximity. Bloodstain analysis charted the order of movement. Downstairs first, then the turn, then the final shots. So clearly that the diagrams needed no labels. There was no murder weapon on the evidence table. It had never been recovered. The state pointed to that absence without apology. If you plan to do a thing and plan to get away, you plan for what the police might find. The missing rifle spoke of intention long before any expert did. The defense rose and tried to change the lighting. They asked about contamination, footprints, first responders, a crowded scene where grief and duty mixed in the same air. They asked whether an outside shooter might have created some of the patterns inside. And then they turned, as everyone knew they would, to the grandfather Curtis Rose and his military-style rifle, murmuring M1 Garand, as if a World War II tool could move through time and make a grandson innocent. Didn't he fire a shot that night? Might there have been others? Couldn't chaos account for what science was calling control? The answers came without heat. Yes, the grandfather fired once, at a fleeing suspect after the killing, striking him in the shoulder. No, the scene inside did not match rounds fired from the yard. The angles and heights were wrong for an outside shooter. The children's lines of sight put the gunman beside them, not beyond a window. The patterns in the hallway and the living room pointed in one direction, inward. Intent rarely arrives wearing a sign. Prosecutors showed it the way the law prefers, by demonstrating choices. Denton came dressed to hunt. He brought a weapon suited to speed. He moved through familiar rooms with no wasted steps. He left alive. He kept the rifle out of law enforcement's hands. He went quiet when caught. This was not a man startled into madness. It was a man carrying out a plan he'd rehearsed in grievance for years. The state did not ignore motive, but it refused to worship it. Jurors learned about the long, sour slope of hatred a son can hold toward a mother, about arguments that refilled themselves even when the house tried to be peaceful, about talk of violence that sounded like swagger until it wasn't. A roommate testified to the awful phrase that anchors too many cases. The defendant had spoken of wanting to go on a rampage. Friends remembered camo clothes worn like a uniform and ammunition carried like a personality. No single person's memory could carry a verdict. Together, they explained why the route through the house looked the way it did. When it was time for the defense case, Denton himself took the stand. He was 19 in the photographs from that summer and older in the chair. He denied shooting anyone. He talked about guns he liked, places he'd been. The blow to his shoulder that the state said came from the grandfather's one desperate shot. Under cross-examination, he was careful. The way people are careful when they know the room around them is made of glass. The prosecutor brought him back to the rooms, to the children who had named what they saw, to the absence of a rifle that only the shooter could explain. The answers grew shorter. Juries are good at hearing what short answers try to hide. Closing arguments returned to the maps. The defense asked the jury to live in the blur. Busy scene, missing gun, a grandfather with a storied weapon, doubt blooming in corners like mold. The state asked for the clarity the evidence had earned. 3 people shot at close range inside their own home. 6 children watching what no child should see. A pattern of movement that felt like a checklist. A defendant found wounded in the way the grandfather's bullet would produce, and unable to produce any rifle that could have moved through the house on its own. Reasonable doubt, the prosecutor said. is not any doubt. It is a doubt you can reason. The judge read the instructions. What first-degree murder requires. How to weigh circumstantial evidence that fits tightly together. How to treat testimony from children recorded outside the courtroom. How to ignore sympathy and anger and decide only on the record. The jurors took the case. They did not run. They walked. Hours later, they returned. The foreperson stood. The clerk asked. The answer was the word the room had been holding in its lungs since the tape went up on Henson Road. Guilty. The sound that followed wasn't a sound. It was a shift. Shoulders falling, hands finding other hands. A grandmother's name said under a breath. A child's face in a gallery growing still because some part of the long waiting was over. The court scheduled sentencing and sent the jurors back to their lives with thanks no one knows how to make big enough. Outside, microphones waited. The sheriff said as little as possible and exactly enough. The district attorney spoke about patience and the children's courage. Defense counsel talked about appeals, as they must. Reporters filed their dispatches. The sky over Bristol did what skies do when justice is administrative. It stayed the same color. Sentencing would come next. Arguments about life measured in years, and the extra counts that stand for the living who were terrorized, and the danger that bled beyond 3 bodies. But the verdict did what verdicts are built to do. It ordered the facts. It told the town that the story they'd been living with since August had a name and a consequence. And it left the house on Henson Road, as it had been since the first siren faded, a place of ordinary walls and impossible memory, now held officially by the truth 12 people carried to its end. Verdicts don't end a case. They open the next, quieter chapter, the one where the law counts years and the families count days. After the word guilty settled over the courtroom, everyone went home to wait for sentencing, the last public measure the system can take. When the day came, the benches filled again with the same faces, changed only by relief and fatigue. The state went first because it had the burden to explain not just what happened, but what justice looks like when 3 people are dead and 6 children carry the memory. The prosecutor did not rehearse the trial. There was no need. Instead, the focus turned to the harm and the future. A home is supposed to be a perimeter against the worst things. On Henson Road, the perimeter failed because a man carried the worst thing through the door in his hands. Victim impact statements followed, each a small world set down where the record could hold it. A cousin spoke about Lena, 57, the grandmother whose voice could turn a messy room into a place where you were glad to be. She was the first call, he said. If something broke, if a child had a fever, if we needed the recipe, nobody wrote down. A friend spoke about Toshia, 39, the mother whose calendar was always full and always somehow had room for one more obligation. She did hard years, the friend said gently, and she was doing better. She was allowed to do better. A neighbor spoke about Jamie, 36, the stepdad who did the small, protective things that add up to safety. Checking the doors, the tires, the smoke alarm battery. He didn't get to do the big heroic thing, the neighbor said. He got taken in seconds. And I think he tried. Then came the words from the people whose courage had already carried the case. The children's voices, channeled through guardians and therapists, because the court would not ask them to stand alone again. They described the night without adjectives. The sounds, the running, the hiding in places where they had played hide and seek before, not knowing that the same closet could hold 2 meanings. The dreams that woke them and the mornings they didn't want to go to school. Because schools are full of questions, even when teachers are kind. The court listened, as courts must, and the sound of pens stopped. The defense spoke of youth, of a 19-year-old with years that had gone crooked, of mental storms and poor impulse control, of a shoulder scar left by a grandfather's defensive shot that night. They asked for mercy, translated into a number. Life, yes. But with the possibility, distant and hypothetical, that the man would not die behind the wall. They said the word hope in the way lawyers do, when hope is a synonym for not all the doors locked forever. The judge, measured, plain, returned to the facts because that is the bench's job. The court found the elements the jury had already held: premeditation, written in movement and method, close-range gunfire delivered with control, a weapon brought in and hidden after, a house turned into a sequence instead of a room for argument. The harm did not end at 3 bodies. It radiated through 6 children who watched, and into a community that learned how thin safety can feel. On the counts that mattered most, the court imposed life without the possibility of parole. Additional counts: aggravated assault, reckless endangerment, the crimes that stand for the living who were terrorized, added years to a sentence already measured in permanence. The numbers stacked not to heap punishment, but to speak in the statute's language about the many people hurt in one short span of time. Paperwork shuffled. A deputy placed a hand on an arm. The door to holding closed behind a man who would not be coming back. Outside, microphones waited because they always do. The sheriff kept it spare. The families and children showed courage. The case was built with care. Nothing brings the dead back. The district attorney thanked the jury and the witnesses, especially the youngest. A defense lawyer spoke of appeals, not as a promise to reverse anything, but as the process that belongs to any sentence this heavy. Then the cameras went away, and the town did what towns do when the legal part is over. It turned back to school schedules, shift work, and the ordinary tasks that grief complicates but cannot cancel. The appeals would tick along in the background: post-trial motions, a notice filed within 30 days, transcripts compiled and checked, briefs arguing that the judge had erred here or there, that a ruling on evidence should have gone another way, that the state's proof of identity and intent relied too much on a missing rifle and too little on a single alternative theory the defense could not let go. Appellate judges would read everything, hear arguments, and, in opinions dry enough to be trustworthy, leave the verdict and sentence where the jury and trial court had placed them. That process would take months, then years, not because anyone was dragging their feet, but because finality in the law is not the same as speed. Families learned how to live with that as a quiet, repeating calendar note, and not the headline it had once been. In the houses around Henson Road, the aftermath looked like errands, with a second purpose. Someone fixed a porch light that had been out since the summer, because light matters more now. Someone kept showing up with casseroles longer than politeness demands because grief eats energy. The school counselor called not once, but several times across the semester because kids don't only struggle in September. A youth coach made sure there was always a spot on a roster and a ride home. Churches set aside minutes where nothing happened on purpose, and that quiet did the work that words can't. People also talked differently. Friends learned to take threats seriously when they're pointed toward family. They learned to see control, anger, and fantasies about violence as risk factors, not moods. If a conversation turned toward guns and grievance, someone in the room now knew the right number to call and the right words to use. Not every intervention saves a life. Enough of them do to make practice worth it. The law learned too, or rather, it reinforced lessons good investigators already know. First-in officers asked the most important questions once, clearly, and recorded answers that stand years later. Child interviews were done right, recorded, non-leading, protected from the circus of live cross-examination. Forensics trusted sequence over spectacle. Angles, stipple, and blood patterns carried the weight that a missing weapon tried to dodge. Prosecutors built a case that didn't rely on a single star witness or test, but on hundreds of small, careful pieces that fit together so tightly there was no reasonable place for doubt to live. As anniversaries came, the names stayed at the center where they belong. Lena, the anchor, Toshia, the mother who ran on grit and lists. Jamie, the steady presence who tried to put himself between danger and the people he loved. Their photos reappeared on mantles and church tables. Not to rehearse pain, but to let memory be ordinary. A snapshot taped back up on the fridge where it had lived before August 29th. A face showing up in a slideshow at a family reunion, because we refuse to cut the past to fit the present. If you're looking for one rule to carry out of the courtroom and into regular life, it is this: keep people at the center. That means telling the story without turning the gunman into the protagonist. It means noticing when someone's world is shrinking around anger and calling that what it is, a risk you may be able to help blunt. It means believing children when they say what they saw and building systems that don't make them say it twice. It means understanding that safety is planned, not hoped for. The law has done what it can do here. A jury spoke, a court imposed. The appeals will echo and fade. What remains is the town's job and ours: to hold Lena, Tasha, and Jamie in the front of the story, to show up for the children until showing up becomes the habit that keeps them steady, and to let the house on Henson Road be remembered for the lives that were lived inside it, not only for the seconds that took them. In the final part, we'll close with what the community chose to keep: rituals, small protections, new habits of attention, and the quiet promise that the way we remember can be part of how we prevent. When a case leaves the front page, the people inside it don't get to. They carry it in small ways that seldom make the news: a porch light that stays on longer than before, a calendar reminder that no one else sees, a habit of checking in that used to feel nosy and now just feels necessary. That's where the story of Henson Road sits now, half in the record, half in the ordinary lives that refuse to fall apart. Some changes were visible. At school pickup, more adults stood a little closer, lingering long enough to trade sentences that used to be texts. Teachers who had watched kids go quiet in September kept calling through October and November, not to demand homework, but to make sure nights were going all right. A coach added one more practice, not for competition but for routine, because routine can be a bridge. The church down the road put a table by the back doors with cards and phone numbers for counseling, legal help, and practical needs. Gas vouchers, childcare lists, the sort of basic supports that don't fix grief but keep it from doing extra damage. Some changes were private. A neighbor who'd always left her blinds open after dusk started closing them early, then months later, opened them again, because living matters. A cousin packed away a box of letters and clothes and then, on a soft Saturday, took it back out and made memory the point, not the injury. The children learned new languages for feelings they didn't know existed, and the adults learned to listen to those languages without rushing to translate them. There were bad days that felt like a step backwards, and there were ordinary days that felt like a miracle. Both counted. The sheriff's office wrote its lessons down in the quiet language police use when they intend to remember. First-in officers reviewed the night like a drill. The single careful question that preserved a child's words, the clear perimeter that kept the scene from being trampled by good intentions, the body camera notes that replaced memory with record. Detectives added a section to their training on domestic space homicides, how to read a house for sequence, how angles, stipple, And blood patterns tell movement without anyone having to perform it in court. How to build a case that stands even when a weapon is missing because the person who used it made it missing on purpose. Advocates and social workers did their own version of writing it down. They made a checklist for the kind of call that begins, "I think someone in my family is getting dangerous." And the checklist didn't wait for bruises. It asked about threats, control, isolation, guns in the house, fantasies of violence spoken like jokes. It mapped exits and safe houses. It put code words on the fridge, phrases that mean "come now" without saying so out loud. It trained friends to keep proof-of-life texts going without turning them into surveillance. It asked the hard question straight. Are you willing to go somewhere else tonight if we can make that possible? And then it made it possible. The county's lawyers and counselors sat together more often. Protective orders moved a little faster. Welfare checks came with a follow-up call a week later, not just a box checked on the night. Dispatchers flagged addresses with context so responding units didn't walk in blind. None of that made the news. It made people safer. Memory found its rituals. A corner of a park got new flowers each spring, and nobody labeled them because nobody needed to. At holiday potlucks, someone always brought Lena's kind of pie, and the person who brought it didn't make a speech. They just put it on the table and let the day carry it. Toshia's friends found ways to keep their group text alive, texting new people in when they recognized the look of a woman carrying too much. Jamie's name came up when a neighbor checked a smoke alarm or fixed a wobbly step. Jamie would have nagged me until I did this. And the joke that wasn't a joke felt like respect. Photos went back where they belonged. On walls, on mantles, on phone lock screens. Not as exhibits, as family. The appeals stayed in the background where they belong once a verdict is sturdy. Deadlines filed, briefs exchanged, oral arguments scheduled months out, decisions issued in language that looks like stone because it's supposed to. When people asked, "Is it over?" the honest answer stayed the same. The sentence is imposed. The process is designed to be slow. The families deserve peace either way, so they made peace locally. Peace is not forgetting. Peace is remembering without letting the memory run your life. If there's a single sentence the case taught out loud, it's this: pay attention before the emergency. When someone's world starts bending around anger and grievance, when camouflage becomes a wardrobe more than a pastime, when guns are carried like identity, when statements about rampage stop sounding like brag and start sounding like rehearsal, treat those as risk, not color. It doesn't mean accuse. It means ask, document, bound, plan. It means give people exits that feel possible and support that isn't a brochure. It means recognizing that home is sometimes the most dangerous place and acting accordingly without shame. And there's a second sentence, just as important: keep victims at the center, in conversations, in coverage, in anniversaries. Say their names first. Resist making the gunman the protagonist. Don't teach children the wrong story by leading with the person who took rather than the people who were. It's not about erasing facts. It's about ordering them so love has a chance to do its work. So here, at the end of the telling, let the ordering be simple and right. Lena was the anchor, a grandmother who made ordinary life possible, the voice that steadied rooms, the first call. Toshia was a mother whose calendar was too full and somehow had space for more, who was doing better and deserved to keep doing better. Jamie was the stepdad who did the small protective things that add up to safety, who tried to put himself between threat and the people he loved. The children were children, brave without choosing to be, honest when asked, alive because they did exactly what survival asked them to do. The house on Henson Road still stands. In a certain light, it looks like every other home on that run of gravel and grass, mowed, quiet, ordinary. That is a kind of victory. Houses are meant to be ordinary. Let the story we keep be the one that returns them to that state as much as we can manage. A place of birthdays and chores and socks on the stairs, not markers and tape. Let the way we remember these three be by the life that was lived around them, not the seconds that took them. What we choose to carry from here is up to us. Vigilance without spectacle, help without judgment, names before headlines, care that lasts longer than casseroles. If we do that, then the worst night this story holds will keep losing power over the days that follow. That is not justice in the courtroom sense. The courtroom already did what it could. It is justice in the way communities practice it, quietly, consistently, together. If you want true cases told with care and the victims at the center, please like this video, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next episode. In the comments, honor their names: Lena Marie Rose, Toshia Michelle Rose Milhorn, and James Jamie Milhorn. And keep the surviving children in your thoughts. Share responsibly. Your support helps us keep making thoughtful, respectful storytelling.